911, what's your emergency? She locked me in the garage. I'm scared. She just shot me. In the quiet suburbs of Gulf Breeze, where palms sway and patrol cars rarely race, one phone call shattered the silence. And what happened that afternoon wasn't an accident. A man called for help. A woman stood silent behind a locked door. And by the time officers arrived, nothing would ever be the same. But this wasn't about just one moment of fear, or one mistake made in anger. This was something else. There were signs. There were calls. There were things no one wanted to say out loud. Two people, bound by love, duty, and something far more complicated. One is no longer here to explain. The other is still trying to tell her side. What really happened inside that house? Why did a man on the phone whisper his last words? And what kind of love ends with a gunshot echoing through a garage? This isn't just the story of a couple. It's a story of power, silence, and everything we miss before it's too late. You've heard the call. Now it's time to understand why it was made. The Bree Coon and Collin Turner story. A true crime documentary. Presented by True Crime Whispers. Before the headlines. Before the sirens. Before the call that would ripple through a nation of military families and suburban neighbors. There were two people. Two paths. And one promise of a future that was supposed to be filled with pride, service, and love. Bree Coon was born in a town where routine was everything. A place stitched together by early mornings, local parades, and neighbors who remembered your name. She was a girl who made her bed with hospital corners long before she knew what that meant. Her teachers remembered her as focused, polite, quiet but never timid. She wasn't chasing popularity. She was chasing precision. After high school, while others debated majors, Bree didn't flinch. She enlisted. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to serve. In the Navy, structure wasn't just welcomed, it was required. And Bree didn't just adjust, she thrived. As a petty officer, she earned more than medals. She earned trust. Her supervisors described her as disciplined, level-headed, the kind of person who didn't need to raise her voice to command respect. To the outside world, she was a rising star. Steady. Unshakable. But there was more to Bree than what showed up on service records. There were glimpses, subtle but telling, that beneath the steel exterior was someone who craved control, not just in her job but in her life. She knew what she wanted. And when she met Collin Turner, she thought she'd found it. Collin Turner grew up differently. Where Bree had discipline, Collin had devotion, to family, to faith, to friends. Raised in the heart of the South, his life revolved around familiar faces and familiar values. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. But when he walked into a room, people smiled. Collin worked in logistics, not glamorous but crucial. He wasn't after medals. He was after meaning. And he found it in helping others. Whether it was volunteering at local youth programs or simply fixing a neighbor's porch light, Collin was always there. He wasn't perfect, but he was present. And when he met Bree, he saw in her something rare, a woman who challenged him, grounded him, and made him want to build something bigger than himself. They met through mutual friends near a Navy base. A conversation turned into a date. A date turned into a habit. And a habit turned into a plan. Bree admired Collin's warmth, his patience, his consistency. Collin admired Bree's clarity, her discipline, her drive. Together they looked good. Two puzzle pieces that fit, at least from the outside. They married in front of family and friends on a clear spring day. Not everyone understood their dynamic, but no one questioned their commitment. She brought structure. He brought softness. And for a while, they brought out the best in each other. But even in the earliest months, there were signs. Small things. Whispers in routine. Moments when choices felt like orders. And compromise started to look like control. Friends said they seemed happy. Family said they looked stable. But pictures don't always capture tone. And sometimes the quietest couples are carrying the heaviest truths. Some homes don't raise alarms. The grass stays trimmed. The lights stay on. From the outside, they tell the story of calm, of order, of love. But the truth? The truth has a way of hiding behind drywall and dinner plates. In Gulf Breeze, Florida, inside this very house, a story was forming. Not the kind that makes headlines immediately, but the kind that simmers. Unseen. Unspoken. Until something breaks. Ask their friends and you'd hear the same phrases. They seemed like a power couple. They balanced each other out. If there were problems, they sure didn't show it. But even harmony can have undertones. And the silence between two people can sometimes speak louder than any argument. One friend later admitted, "We all thought they were solid, until I realized I hadn't heard Collin speak in more than 5 minutes at that dinner. Bree did all the talking. She led the whole conversation. He just smiled. It began with subtle shifts. He stopped staying up for her. She stopped asking if he wanted to eat. They shared a roof, but less and less of a rhythm. Text messages between Bree and a longtime friend show her irritation with how passive Collin had become. I feel like I'm doing everything. I'm the adult. He's just there. But what Bree saw as passivity, Collin's family described as pressure. An emotional tightening that made him retreat into himself. Bree was by all accounts impressive, disciplined, tactical, ambitious. But in a high-performance life, emotions are often boxed up for later. And sometimes later never comes. Her job required control, structure. Her expectations, high. For Collin, who valued spontaneity and softness, the atmosphere inside their home was starting to feel more like a command post. According to one close friend of Collin, he told me, "She doesn't yell. That's not her way. But it's like I can't breathe around her." There were signs, but not the kind that spark interventions. One friend recalled. They came over for dinner. Collin joked about how Bree tracks their finances down to the dollar. Got a laugh. But there was something in his face when she looked at him afterward. Like that joke wasn't supposed to be said out loud. Another friend remembered the way Bree would check her watch during casual outings, always calculating, always aware. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter. Something harder to name. Neighbors started noticing small changes. The sound of the garage opening late at night. Lights on at odd hours. Long gaps between when one car left and the other returned. Surveillance footage from a neighboring home, never released publicly, showed Collin pacing in the driveway at 2 a.m. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't smoking. Just pacing. Like he was waiting for something. Or someone. And sometimes, the garage door would close before he could even go inside. 2 messages. Sent 2 days apart. To 2 different people. From Bree. "I feel boxed in. Like I'm expected to play this perfect role. And I'm tired." From Collin. "She's not violent. But I can't shake the feeling something's building." Both felt trapped. But neither of them talked to each other about it. They had built a life together. But emotionally, they were in 2 different houses. At a family gathering months before the call, something strange happened. A toast was raised. Collin thanked Bree, but his voice trembled. Later that night he went outside alone for nearly an hour. His mother would say later, "That wasn't just tiredness. That was withdrawal. Something in my son was dimming." A personal notebook of Bree's later revealed her effort to maintain control over everything. Schedules. Training metrics. Weekly reflections. One entry stood out. Recalibrate. Be less emotional. Don't let weakness show. But what she considered weakness might have been the very thing Collin needed. In hindsight, every crack seems obvious. Every pause, filled with meaning. Every gesture, a cry for help. But in real time, you're just trying to make it through the day. Their story wasn't about one argument. It was about 1,000 moments that slipped through the cracks. 1,000 chances to say something that never came. And one day, one call, would bring everything crashing down. Some endings don't explode. They unfold. Minute by minute. Choice by choice. In the days leading up to the call that changed everything, something inside both Bree Kuhn and Collin Turner began to fray. Not loudly, not obviously, but relentlessly. In the last 7 days of their shared life, the arguments became more frequent, but also more contained. Neighbors heard nothing. But the tension was no longer verbal, it was atmospheric. One friend who received a late-night message from Collin later recalled. He said, "She's not yelling, but I can feel her thinking. It's like, everything I do is wrong and she doesn't have to say a word." At work, Bree maintained control. But her tone had sharpened. Her presence, once magnetic, now came with weight. Her commanding officer noted a change in her precision, not technically but emotionally. She was showing up, yes, but leaving pieces of herself behind. A few of the messages exchanged in those final days were later recovered. Not the kind you'd expect from people on the verge. No screaming. No threats. Just this. "Bree, I can't sleep in that house tonight. I need air." "Collin, are we okay?" "Bree, define okay." Or this. "Collin, you still see me?" "Bree, I don't know what I see anymore." One message from Collin to a friend simply read, "I started recording things. Just in case. Not because of what she might do, but because of how little he trusted himself to explain it afterward. One night, Bree didn't go inside. She stayed in the car. For nearly 6 hours. No music. No phone calls. Just her. Alone. With whatever thoughts she wouldn't say out loud. According to a coworker she texted the next morning, she said, "I had to decompress. I didn't feel safe with my own reactions. Not about Collin. About herself. There are no reports of physical harm. No reports of criminal behavior. But emotional instability doesn't always wear handcuffs. Sometimes it wears fatigue." Collin had called 911 before. Not to report violence, but for peace. One dispatcher described his tone as panicked but soft. Not fear of what had happened, but of what might. "She locked me out. I just want to talk to someone. I don't want to escalate anything." He wasn't asking for punishment. He was asking for pause. One of his last calls, made just 4 days before the shooting, ended with him whispering, "It's like she's not hearing me anymore." No report was filed. No one came to the house. He declined a visit, saying, "It's probably nothing. I just needed someone to answer." Then came the calm before the storm. A dinner out. Just the two of them. Servers described them as cordial, quiet, civil. They shared a dessert. He opened her door when they left. She laughed at something he said on the sidewalk. But a bartender who watched them from across the room later said, "It was like watching two people act out a script. They smiled, but there was nothing behind it. Just silence and nice clothing." And in the car ride home. No music. No words. Just a few more hours until everything would break. There are no sudden moments in emotional erosion. Just slow collapses. Bree had begun journaling again, though much of it was tactical. Lists, times, outcomes. One entry read, "I am tired of managing everything. I don't know how to say that without it sounding like blame." Collin had begun leaving the bedroom light on, even when he wasn't in the room. Subtle rituals. Unconscious signals. The kind you only notice in hindsight. On the final night, there were no police reports. No neighbors calling in a disturbance. Just silence. But inside that garage, inside that house, years of pressure reached their boiling point. And when the call came in the next morning, when Collin's voice broke through the receiver, it wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the very end of a slow-motion tragedy that nobody saw coming, even as it unfolded in plain sight. Wednesday, September 8, 2021. The air was humid. The skies were clear. And the house at the end of the cul-de-sac looked like any other. But behind the walls of 317 Patterson Street, something was already shifting. According to time logs from the naval base, Bree Kuhn reported for duty at exactly 0700 hours. Routine. Precise. She was in uniform. On time. Fully composed. Neighbors recall seeing Collin take the trash out shortly after. No visible distress. No raised voices. Just silence between them, like background noise nobody tuned into. At 12:47 p.m., Bree left the base. No scheduled early departure. No reason logged. She didn't tell anyone she was heading home. But she did. We don't know what words were exchanged when Bree walked through the door. But it wasn't peace. One neighbor, who was out walking her dog, would later say, "I saw her pull up fast. She walked in with intention. She didn't even close the car door all the way." Inside, whatever they said was not loud. But it was sharp. Collin later that afternoon made his first call to 911. 911, what's your emergency? We're arguing. I just need some help talking this through. The call was classified as non-urgent. No officer was dispatched. At 2:14 p.m. he called again. This time there was hesitation in his tone. She took my keys. Locked the back door. It's just getting tense. Again, no action was taken. At 3:08 p.m. the final call came in. 911, what's your emergency? Collin's voice wasn't panicked. It was controlled. Measured. But there was an edge, a tremor that hadn't been there before. She locked me in the garage. I'm scared. Seconds pass. A sound. Not a voice. Not a word. Just something distant and percussive, like a door slamming hard, or something more. Then clear. Final. She just shot me. What followed were 4 distinct audio spikes. It's just seconds apart. The line remains open. Collin doesn't speak again. There's no screaming. No scrambling. Just the hum of static. The operator tries to regain contact. Over and over again. Sir? Are you okay? Can you hear me? Nothing. Dispatch finally marks the call as critical. Officers are set. Estimated arrival time, 3 minutes 41 seconds. When officers pulled up to the residence, there were no screams, no chaos, no frantic pleas. Bree Kuhn was already outside. Come. Unarmed. Waiting. According to the initial officer report, she said, "He's inside. I didn't want anyone else to get hurt." Her hands were steady. Her tone was even. She was placed in hand restraints without resistance. No attempt to flee. No visible emotion. Inside the garage, officers located Collin. He was unresponsive. Paramedics arrived within minutes. But by then, the silence had settled in for good. News broke quickly. A Navy officer. A domestic dispute. A shooting. But the details weren't released. Not that day. Not for weeks. What no one understood, not yet, was how two people once celebrated, once in love, had reached such a quiet, irreversible breaking point. This wasn't about a moment. It was about the moments that came before, and the ones that would ripple long after. The courthouse was quiet the morning jury selection began. But the silence wasn't peace. It was weight. The weight of unanswered questions. Of a life taken. And another on the line. Inside it wasn't just a case. It was the collapse of a story. Two people who once exchanged vows. Now separated by walls, silence, and evidence. After her arrest, Bree Kuhn cooperated. She didn't run. She didn't deny the event. But her words were complex. In her recorded interview, Bree claimed she acted out of fear. She said the situation escalated quickly, that she was kicked, cornered, and overwhelmed. Her words were, "I panicked. I wasn't trying to. I just couldn't think." But when the prosecution reviewed the 911 call, they heard no sound of a struggle. No physical altercation. Only fear. From Collin. The defense leaned heavily on emotional buildup. They described Bree not as aggressive, but as exhausted. A woman under constant pressure. From her commanding officers. From her marriage. From herself. They presented months of messages, not violent, but full of strain. Moments where Bree used phrases like, "I can't breathe in this house. I feel erased." They painted Collin not as abusive, but as emotionally unpredictable. A man struggling with depression, with desperation. But there was a problem. When it came time to present evidence of Bree's physical injuries, there were none. No bruising. No scratches. No medical reports suggesting recent harm. Just words. And in court, words go far but not far enough without proof. The prosecution brought their case with quiet force. Their anchor? That 911 call. They brought in an audio expert to confirm timing and volume. They showed that Bree had not called 911 herself. Not before. Not after. And when it came time for Bree to speak, she didn't. Legally, she didn't have to take the stand. But morally, some jurors expected it. They wanted to hear her voice. To understand her fear. To know if there was more. But her counsel advised against it. One wrong phrase, one slip, could undo the entire defense. And so, she stayed silent. That silence echoed through the courtroom, louder than any testimony could have. Perhaps the most damning piece of evidence wasn't visual or auditory. It was medical. A full examination of Bree conducted post-arrest showed no recent physical trauma, no defensive wounds, no visible injuries. The prosecution leaned into this. She says she was scared. She says she was kicked. But her body tells a different story. And the jury listened. In closing, the room shifted. Gone were the timelines. Gone were the diagrams. This was about memory. Loss. Collin's mother held up a photograph. Her son at age 5, smiling, wild hair, a birthday hat slipping sideways. She told the court, "I used to worry when he'd ride his bike too fast. I never thought this would be how he'd leave me." The room fell still. Jurors leaned forward. Even Bree looked up. Tears, for the first time, quietly appeared in her eyes. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The charge, premeditated fatality. The verdict, guilty. No hesitation. No lesser count. The judge spoke plainly. His voice didn't shake. "You are hereby sentenced to life in prison. Without parole." But even in justice, not everything is revealed. One set of notes was deemed inadmissible. Private records. From therapy sessions Bree had attended in the months prior. In those pages she allegedly wrote, "Sometimes I feel like I'm losing control. Like something is going to snap." The jury never saw it. Never knew. Was it a warning sign? Or a woman seeking help before it was too late? No one will ever know, because that part of the story was sealed, like so many others before it. Some stories end in silence. But silence doesn't mean understanding. To understand, we have to go further. Into the human mind. Into the gray areas no verdict can touch. To understand what happened between Bree and Collin, we turn to those who've spent their lives studying not what people do, but why. Dr. Kayla Hendricks, a forensic psychologist with 2 decades of experience, had never met Bree Coon. But after reviewing the details, the statements, the pressure, the background, she had this to say. What I see is a fracture in identity. Bree lived in 2 worlds, the commander and the companion. One demanded control. The other begged for surrender. According to Dr. Hendricks, this wasn't just stress. It was the collision of roles that were never meant to coexist. When a person leads a unit, they're trained to eliminate threats. But what happens when they believe, even for a moment, that the threat is in their own home? It's rare, she says. But under extreme psychological pressure, when the mind becomes unable to separate danger from discomfort, perception becomes weaponized. It wasn't justification, but it was a crack of context. Dr. Michael Staves, a specialist in complex relationship dynamics, analyzed what he called a nonlinear emotional dependency. This wasn't about fists or fear in the traditional sense. This was about erosion. Slow. Invisible. A kind of emotional drought. He described a dynamic in which both partners likely felt unseen, but expressed it in opposing ways. Bree by taking on more, commanding more, trying to stay in control. Collin by pulling inward. By needing her in quiet desperation. You see this dance often, he explains. One person overfunctions. The other underfunctions. And both feel abandoned. And sometimes when no one surrenders, someone snaps. By the time the trial opened, public opinion was divided. But in a court of law, feelings are not facts. Legal analyst Denise Marrow laid out the key pivot points that turned the jury. The 911 call wasn't just a piece of evidence, it was a narrative. A man calling for help. A voice that didn't sound threatening, but frightened. Marrow explained that self-defense laws hinge on reasonable belief. But the prosecution, in her words, stripped reason from Bree's claim. There were no injuries. No indication of immediate harm. And the calm nature of her arrest, it didn't match the story of terror. Worse yet, Bree didn't testify. Silence in the courtroom, Marrow says, can be deafening. To understand the layers of Bree Coon, you have to understand military culture. Dr. Elijah Vargas, a retired Navy officer turned behavioral consultant, said it bluntly. We train warriors to suppress vulnerability. We reward stoicism. But that doesn't mean they're immune to collapse. In his eyes, Bree may have been carrying a kind of silent warfare. Not with Collin, but within herself. When you've been programmed to push through, to lead, to never falter, the home becomes the only place you're allowed to break. But what if the home feels like the battlefield too? He described a phenomenon often overlooked in female service members. Command without release. Leadership without relief. Excellence without pause. She may have believed she was holding everything together. Until she wasn't. Not all the experts agreed. Some believed the warning signs were there. Others saw a tragedy that could never have been predicted. Some saw self-protection. Others saw control. But they all agreed on one thing. This was not a story of good and evil. It was a story of tension. Of silence. Of fractures too small to notice, until they broke everything. Understanding the why doesn't bring back the what. But sometimes, understanding is all we have left. Behind these walls, there are no ranks. No medals. No flags. Just numbers. And silence. Today, Bree Coon wakes each morning to the same light through the same narrow window. A decorated sailor once responsible for others' lives. Now lives in a space barely wider than a twin mattress. She's reportedly kept to herself. Quiet. Routine. Disciplined even here. There have been no recorded behavioral infractions. No interviews. No appeals filed. At least not yet. Some say she's accepted her fate. Others say, she's still trying to understand it. For Collin Turner's family, the silence feels heavier. His mother, in a rare statement after the trial, said this. He wasn't perfect, but he was kind. He didn't deserve this. Friends remember Collin as someone who showed up. To fix a tire, to bring food, to sit quietly when words wouldn't help. One friend recalled. He never raised his voice. Not once. But he laughed like someone who hadn't been hurt yet. That's the Collin I miss. His father visits the site where the incident occurred every year on the same day. He brings sunflowers, Collin's favorite. And he never speaks. The home was sold. The photos were taken down. But the story never really left the walls. Neighbors still talk about it in hushed tones. Some say they hear sounds that aren't there. Others simply moved away. What remains is a kind of collective breath, held, and never exhaled. In the wake of Bree's sentencing, whispers turned into questions. Inside the military and beyond. Could this have been prevented? Should the signs have been flagged? Was there a moment where someone could have pulled them both back? A quiet internal review began, focused on military reporting systems for domestic tension. No official reforms have been passed, but conversations have begun. And sometimes, that's the hardest part. One commanding officer, who requested anonymity, offered this. We train them to be strong. But maybe it's time we train them to ask for help too. What happens when two worlds collide? When the protector becomes the feared? When the one who wore honor becomes the one who broke it? It's not always loud. It's not always explosive. Sometimes it's just one quiet day, when something snaps. And in that silence, we're left to wonder, was this fate or failure? Sometimes the quietest homes hold the loudest cries for help. But help doesn't always come when it's needed. Sometimes it comes too late. What if someone had asked the right question? Listened a little longer? Seen the pain beneath the smile? We may never know what really happened behind their closed doors. But we know how it ended. And that's why stories like this must be told. Not to relive the tragedy, but to remind us that these moments don't appear out of nowhere. They build, they whisper, and then they break. If you or someone you know is struggling, with stress, with silence, with the weight of what feels like too much, please reach out. There's no shame in asking. No weakness in breaking the pattern. Telephone receiver military crisis line. 1-800-273-8255, press 1. Telephone receiver national domestic hotline. 800-799-SAFE. Speech balloon, you're not alone. What remains is what we choose to do next. Was this a case of fear or fury? A tragedy sparked by trauma? Or a calculated moment cloaked in emotion? We may never know what truly lived in Bree's heart that day, or what final thought crossed Collin's mind. But what we do know is that stories like this demand reflection. They ask us not just to look, but to see. So, let us know what you believe. Do you see a woman pushed to her limit? Or a man failed by silence and misread warnings? Your voice matters. Your thoughts could be the beginning of someone else's understanding. If you found this story important, share it with someone. These moments matter. They're not just about what was lost, but what might still be saved. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that shine light into the darkest places. Because when the truth hides behind closed doors, it's only by opening them that we begin to heal.